All right, let's dive into something uh, pretty interesting, I think.
Okay.
How American gay culture has looked at promiscuity
Okay.
and how it's been shown, like represented,
Yeah.
both good and bad, and how all that has kind of shaped gay identity and culture.
Right.
We've got some really interesting sources for this deep dive,
Cool.
like academic texts, critical essays,
Oh,
a
wow.
little bit of Broadway stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll see like the connection between cruising and how we kind of experience public spaces, and maybe even find out that those who like really condemn promiscuity might have some fantasies themselves.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that like we often just focus on the behaviors themselves, but it's actually the anxieties around those behaviors that can tell us a lot about a society.
Okay, so first we've got to deal with the word promiscuity itself.
Yeah.
It's kind of loaded, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Like if someone calls you promiscuous, it's not really a compliment.
Right. It's definitely a word that has some baggage, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's often used to, label and shame people, especially those whose sexual behavior is outside of what society thinks is acceptable.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where Gail Rubin's idea of the charm circle comes in.
Right, exactly. Rubin argues that society draws this line between like good sex and bad sex. It's kind of like, a wedding ring equals pure acceptable sex.
Yeah.
But casual hookups or anything outside of that monogamous, heterosexual ideal is often labeled promiscuous and pushed outside of the charmed circle.
Yeah. So even though what's considered acceptable has changed over time,
Yeah.
promiscuity, especially outside of marriage and kids, is usually, looked down upon
Right.
by society.
For sure.
Like think about Playboy.
Okay.
It kind of made straight male promiscuity more mainstream, right?
Right.
But at the same time, gay culture was still hidden and had to be more discreet.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of like double standards, right? And how these cultural anxieties about sexuality can lead to completely different rules for different groups.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So how did gay male culture, which like for so long had to be, in secret,
Yeah.
how did it evolve into this age of promiscuity that we hear about?
Well, you can kind of trace it back to the mid-20th century,
Okay.
when being gay was often a crime or seen as a mental illness.
Right.
And, when your whole identity is seen as wrong, your sexual expression often becomes hidden and secretive.
Right. And of course, Stonewall happened in '69.
Right.
Like a huge turning point.
Absolutely. It was a rebellion.
Yeah.
And it opened the door for more, open ways to express sexuality,
Right.
including exploring promiscuity as a way to push back against norms and claim a sense of freedom.
Yeah. But even before Stonewall, there were some unexpected places where these same-sex encounters were happening, right?
Oh, yeah, you wouldn't believe it, but even the military.
What?
Yeah. This place that's known for being like hyper-masculine and homophobic
Right.
played a role during World War II.
Wow.
When men were, living in close quarters.
Yeah.
There was this whole culture of same-sex encounters
Really?
driven by desire. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also fear of being caught.
Right.
And this intense need for secrecy.
Yeah. It's crazy to think that this institution that was supposed to uphold, masculinity
Right.
was in a way kind of fostering same-sex desire, even though it was trying to suppress it.
Right. Total mixed messages. Right.
Yeah.
It really shows that tension between, what society expects and what people actually want.
Right.
And that tension continued into the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
which a lot of people think of as like the peak of the age of promiscuity in gay male culture.
Right. A time of incredible liberation and exploration, but also like we'll see a time of, debate and division within the community.
Absolutely.
So we'll get into all that right after this.
Yeah, it was this time of upheaval and change.
And people had like really different ideas about what this new era of sexual freedom meant.
Yeah.
Some saw promiscuity as a way to like rebel against the norms that had kept them oppressed. They saw it as like a celebration of their bodies and desires.
But not everyone felt that way, though, right?
Right.
Some saw it as a problem.
Exactly.
Maybe even as something that could hurt the movement for gay rights.
Yeah, you had some people who were worried that all this focus on sex would just reinforce those bad stereotypes.
Right.
And make it harder to be accepted by mainstream society.
Yeah.
They worried that it would like overshadow the fight for things like equal rights and legal protections.
It's like that whole idea of respectability politics we hear about today.
Oh, totally.
Like you have to act a certain way
Right.
to be accepted by the mainstream, even if it means hiding who you are.
It's a great comparison.
Yeah.
It was this struggle between wanting to be free
Yeah.
and wanting to be seen as legitimate, you know?
By a society that was often suspicious of them.
Okay, so let's talk about a writer who really captured this energy.
Okay.
John Ricci, the author of City of Night.
Oh, yeah.
His book really gets into that whole world
Yeah.
of hustlers and drag queens and the whole underground scene of like urban cruising.
His work is so powerful because it doesn't shy away from the realities
Right.
of that life.
Right.
There's this one passage where he talks about cruising as like a language of the flesh.
Wow.
A way to communicate desire in a world where words weren't enough.
Right.
Or were even dangerous.
It makes you think that for a lot of gay men at the time, these weren't just about sex.
Right.
It was about finding connection and community in a world that was really hostile towards them.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember, not everyone experienced this liberation in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't talk about this time without thinking about Black gay men who often had a different experience. You know, white gay men were feeling this new freedom.
Right.
But Black gay men were still dealing with racism and fetishization even within the gay community.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even within marginalized groups, there can be like further marginalization based on race or class, other factors.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, everything changed with AIDS.
Right.
It was this dark cloud over everything.
The AIDS crisis was devastating, you know, for gay male communities. It was so much suffering and loss.
Right.
And it also changed how people thought about sexuality and promiscuity.
Yeah.
Suddenly, something that had been about freedom and pleasure became linked with disease and death.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
To think about how a whole community was affected.
Right.
Like fear and stigma just took over.
Yeah, and within all that, you had some strong reactions.
Right.
Larry Kramer, you know, a writer and activist, became a controversial figure during this time.
Yeah.
He really condemned promiscuity, saying it was hurting the gay community and holding it back from equality.
He even said being gay offers much more than that, talking about promiscuity.
Right, a strong statement for sure.
Yeah. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, Kramer thought gay men should strive for more than just sexual liberation. He saw, like, chasing fleeting pleasures as a distraction from bigger goals, like social and political change.
Yeah.
And his views were shaped by all the loss and suffering he was seeing. You know, people were dying. And he felt this urgency to change things.
It's a reminder that even within a community, there can be really different viewpoints.
Absolutely.
Especially in times of crisis.
Yeah. And the AIDS crisis made a lot of people reevaluate their choices and their beliefs about sexuality. I'm curious, how did the AIDS crisis change your understanding of promiscuity? What do you think about how complex that period was?
That's something everyone should think about. We've talked about the history, but let's get into some of the more nuanced stuff.
Okay.
Like, how does promiscuity relate to traditional ideas about masculinity and femininity within gay male culture?
That's interesting because for a long time, gay male culture was dominated by certain masculine ideals.
Right.
You know, the emphasis on being a top versus a bottom,
Yeah.
or the pressure to look a certain way. And these ideals influenced everything from sexual practices to the dynamics of cruising.
Because like those ideas were shaping who was seen as desirable and how people were supposed to express their sexuality.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even those who like embodied these hyper masculine ideals might have secretly wanted monogamy and deeper connection.
Yeah, it shows these categories aren't black and white. People are complex and their desires can be fluid and contradictory.
For sure.
And what about femme gay men?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That often gets overlooked. Femme gay men, and especially drag queens, have often challenged those masculine norms.
By expressing their sexuality in ways that defy expectations.
Right.
They create their own spaces and subcultures within the larger gay community. And they often use humor and performance to subvert those traditional ideas about gender and desire.
It's like they're saying, we're not going to fit into your box.
Right.
We're going to make our own rules and celebrate our own ways of expressing ourselves.
Exactly.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
We've talked about how society sees promiscuity. But what about the individual?
Right.
What makes someone promiscuous in the first place?
Well, for some, it's this idea of transgression. Pushing boundaries and challenging norms. Exploring the unknown. Testing limits and stepping outside the boxes society tries to put us in.
I think everyone can relate to that.
Right.
That desire to rebel,
Yeah.
to experience something forbidden or taboo.
There's definitely something alluring about the forbidden.
Yeah.
It's like this primal urge to push the limits. Okay, to illustrate this, let's talk about David Wojnarowicz.
Okay.
An artist and writer who looked at desire, space, and memory.
Right.
Wojnarowicz was fascinating.
Yeah.
He wrote about his experiences cruising in abandoned buildings and landscapes. It's like he was claiming these forgotten spaces.
Right.
Making them his own, tuning them into spaces of desire and connection.
His work really challenges our ideas about where gay sexuality can exist.
Yeah.
It's not just bars and clubs. It can be anywhere.
Right.
And it can be this powerful force for reclaiming space
Right.
and challenging norms.
Makes you wonder, what are the unspoken boundaries you encounter
Right.
in expressing your sexuality?
Yeah.
Where are the places you feel free to be yourself?
That's such an important question.
Yeah.
Because it gets to the heart of how we deal with a world that tries to control our desires.
We're always getting messages about what's okay and what's not.
Right.
But it's up to each person to decide how they want to express themselves.
And that leads us to the question of how these ideas about promiscuity are still playing out today.
Right.
You know, even now in the 21st century, the past still shapes how we think about sex and relationships.
Right. We're still dealing with that tension between those who want sexual freedom and those who want more traditional relationships.
It's this ongoing debate
Yeah.
between being an individual and belonging. And it's everywhere, from dating apps to social media to activism.
And then you have unsafe sex practices coming back.
Right.
Which makes things even more complex.
The reasons for this are complicated. For some, it's a reaction to the fear from the AIDS crisis. It's a way to reclaim pleasure and reject the stigma.
Right. It's like rebelling against the idea that sex has to be safe and controlled.
Exactly. And for others, it might be tied to a feeling of fatalism.
Okay.
Like, life is short, so just go for it.
Regardless of the risks,
Yeah.
it's a reminder that the past isn't really over.
Right.
And the choices we make, both individually and as a group, still affect us today.
Absolutely.
So where does that leave us?
Yeah.
How do we navigate this whole thing with desire and responsibility?
Right.
Individuality and community.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with recognizing that there are so many different experiences and perspectives within the gay community.
It's about understanding there's no one right way to be gay.
Right.
And everyone has to find their own path.
Exactly. And it's about being open and honest about these things, even when it's hard or uncomfortable.
You know, there are groups out there trying to change this whole conversation about promiscuity.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Sex Panic?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're doing really important work.
Yeah. What are they about?
Well, they're activists who are fighting against the policing of public sex and non-monogamous relationships.
Okay.
They say these things are unfairly targeted.
Right.
And that consent and harm reduction should be the focus.
So they're connecting the fight for sexual freedom with like broader social justice movements.
Exactly. They're saying that the right to be sexual on your own terms,
right,
without judgment or fear, is a basic human right.
Their work is a reminder that this whole discussion about promiscuity isn't over.
Right.
And that it affects everyone, not just gay men.
Yeah. It's about challenging norms and creating a world that's fairer for all.
And it's about recognizing the power of desire.
Right.
And how it can change individuals and communities.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
From the secret worlds of cruising in the mid-20th century to the explosion of freedom in the 70s and 80s to the impact of AIDS and the debates about promiscuity that are still happening.
It's been a journey.
Yeah.
Through history and culture and personal experience.
We've talked about John Ricci.
Yeah.
And his look at urban cruising. Larry Kramer and his views on promiscuity.
Right.
And David Wojnarowicz and his exploration of desire.
Yeah. In those unexpected places.
We've seen how promiscuity has been both demonized and celebrated.
Right.
How it's been shaped by society and politics. And how it's still a source of tension and possibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that promiscuity isn't just one thing.
Right.
It's been experienced and understood in so many different ways.
Yeah, throughout history and across cultures.
Exactly. It's been a source of liberation and pain, a reason for social change, and a target of moral panic.
And it reminds us that sexuality is a fundamental part of being human.
Right.
And that trying to control it often has bad consequences.
Absolutely.
Another takeaway is that this conversation about promiscuity is about more than just sex.
Yeah.
It's about power, identity,
right.
and the right to make your own choices.
It's about challenging norms and making a fairer world for everyone.
And finally, this deep dive has shown how important empathy and understanding are.
Right. Even if we don't agree with other people's choices.
Yeah.
We need to try to see things from their point of view and recognize how complex human experience is.
It's about moving beyond judgment and creating space for dialogue.
Yeah.
Even when it's hard.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, walk a mile in their shoes. You know, you might not agree with their choices, but you can at least try to understand where they're coming from.
Right.
So if promiscuity is like so natural, you know, even for people who try to deny it, how can we create a culture that's really accepting of all kinds of sexual expression?
That's the tough part, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it starts with looking at ourselves, you know, examining our own biases about what's normal or acceptable.
Right.
It means being willing to have those open conversations about sexuality, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's like we've been taught to be afraid of these conversations, right?
Yeah.
To avoid anything that challenges things.
Right.
But if we want a more inclusive world, we have to face those fears.
I agree. It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be sexual.
Yeah.
And that everyone has the right to explore their desires and make their own choices.
As long as they're not hurting anyone.
Exactly. It's about consent, respect, and understanding.
Right.
And maybe letting go of judgment a little.
Yeah.
And embracing how messy human desire can be.
It's about making a world where people feel safe.
Yeah.
To be themselves without being shamed.
Right. A world where we celebrate differences instead of being afraid of them.
Yeah, it's a world I want to live in.
I do.
So if you want to learn more about this, we recommend checking out some of the sources we talked about.
Yeah. John Rishi's City of Night is a must-read.
Yeah.
It's a real and honest look at urban cruising in the 60s. And it captures those feelings of desire and connection when being gay was still taboo.
And for a different view of this time, you could read some of Larry Kramer's work.
Right.
He was controversial, but his writing shows us the worries and debates during the AIDS crisis.
And if you want something that will really challenge how you think about desire and space, I'd say check out David Wojnarowicz.
Yeah.
His art and writing are really powerful.
And don't forget about groups like Sex Panic.
Oh, yeah, they're doing amazing work.
Fighting for a more inclusive world where all kinds of sexual expression are okay.
Right. Their activism shows us that this fight for sexual freedom is still happening.
Yeah.
And that it's connected to so many other issues. It's about having control over your own body.
Right.
And the right to be who you are.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing those boundaries.
Yeah.
We've only just started here.
Right.
There's a lot more out there to discover.
Remember, this conversation about promiscuity is really a conversation about ourselves, about how we treat each other and what kind of world we want.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy exploring.